And I hope to address the problem that informs the workshop that we've just had by asking the following question. What happens when Islam becomes a proper name, when Islam becomes a historical subject in Islamic studies scholarship? Does it supplement or take the place of properly theological subjects like God and or the Prophet? Now, this question is set, as I'm sure you can tell already, within a context of scholarship marked by at least two traditions of thinking about the theological in modern times. And one is dominated by the refrain, the return of religion, roughly from the 1980s. And this particular tradition of thinking about the transformation or survival or resurgence, indeed, of the theological takes as its reference point mostly the sociological literature on modernization, Weber, Durkheim, even indeed Marcel Mauss and people like that. It's mostly sociologists. And the question, of course, is can religion survive, or can the theological survive? And I know that the two are not identical terms. The process of rationalization that is meant to proceed from the modernity that was at the center of attention of people like Weber or Durkheim. Those who from the 1980s either bemoaned or exulted in the so-called return of religion seem not to have read their Weber or Durkheim particularly closely, because of course nothing they said about modernity precluded the presence of religion or the theological. Indeed, very often it was the apparent exceptionality, and I'll come back to this term, the exception, the very exceptionality of religion or the theological in the process of modernity's rationalization that made it an even more powerful element in that modernity. And obviously one only needs to think about Weber's famous, perhaps too famous book on the Protestant ethic, or Marcel Mauss on the gift, to understand that the last thing these thinkers were doing was predicting the disappearance of either religion or the theological. The other tradition, now somewhat more popular in scholarly circles, has to do, and we have a great expert on it here, Sam Zeitlin, has to do with the work of Carl Schmitt and the so-called secularization of theological categories in modern politics. And while many have taken this description as being one that signals the survival again, often unmitigated survival of the theological, and now it is theology and not religion, in modern times and through politics in particular, fewer have actually focused on what I want to focus on, which is what does it mean to think about the theological in a modernity where theology cannot own its own name, where the theological principle, and Schmitt, of course, offers famously sovereignty as a great example of such a principle, doesn't offer itself up in theological terms. What happens to the theological in that kind of context? What does secularization mean in Schmitt's famous invocation? Sam knows much more about it than I do, but I'll take a stab at it in terms of the work on Islam as a proper name. But I wanted to begin with these two narratives, if only to foreground the role of the exception in both of them. Whether it is the gift as the exceptional moment in an economy otherwise determined by contract in Marcel Mauss, or sovereignty as a form of exception for Carl Schmitt, the very exceptionality of, even perhaps in some senses, marginality of the theological is what makes it even more powerful in modern times. And I wonder whether the emergence of Islam, that name, that term, as a subject, a new kind of subject in the study of religion, in the study of Islam and Islamic studies, can be thought about in these terms. That is to say, as a placeholder for the theological that cannot own its own name. Or is it a substitute or a supplement? You can go through a Derridian reading. You can do many readings of this. So let me give you an example of what I mean by invoking a book once upon a time very famous called The Future of Islam by Wilfred Scaven Blunt, a book published in 1882 here in London. It appeared before the book's publication as a couple of articles, I think in the Edinburgh Review the year previously, 1 or 2 years previously. And Wilfred Scaven Blunt was a sometime British diplomat, breeder of Arabian horses, friend of Randolph and Winston Churchill's, advisor to them as well, wealthy landed English figure, also one of the great anti-imperial thinkers of the 19th and early 20th century, despite perhaps because of his many connections to the highest levels of government power and wealth in the British Empire. So in 1882, he writes this book called The Future of Islam, and I want to dwell briefly on the title itself, because it's an interesting title. What does it mean to name a book The Future of Islam? Can Islam have a future? Who can make that future? What is Islam doing in this title? Has it become, as I think it has become, a proper name and a subject in its own right, a historical subject? So on the one hand, Islam is a subject, an agent almost, which therefore can have a future in a way that objects don't or cannot. On the other hand, it is only a potential or a pseudo subject, because as we shall see, it can be and should be instrumentalized and pushed into its own future. And that, I think, is the fundamental ambiguity with the making of Islam as a proper name. So what does he say in this book? What Blunt wants to do as a friend of Islam and of Muslims is to save it from the wholesale and rapid colonization of the Muslim world, what comes to be known as the Muslim world, by European powers. And it is to be saved by being taken under British protection in a kind of partnership that is made possible because the British Empire, largely due to its inclusion of India, happens to include within itself more Muslims than the Ottoman Empire, the other big site of Muslim population. So shifting from theology to demography, Blunt makes an argument for Britain as the protector of Islam, which is to be divested of its Ottoman connections and recentered according to its origins in Arabia. So Arabia gets to be the natural center because it lies at the origins of Islam. But of course, it is India's Muslim population, their role in the British Indian Army, and other Muslim populations from West Africa, from Southeast Asia, from other parts of the world, that allow Arabia to be, as it were, the depoliticized center of this new Muslim world. And Islam under British protection is meant then to spread precisely in sub-Saharan Africa and in Southeast Asia and in South Asia, because the Mediterranean world of the Ottoman Empire, Blunt sees as being already, and presciently sees as being already in the grasp of the French and the Spaniards and the Italians and others. So Islam can only be saved where it is most alive, in the southern bit of Asia and Africa, with Britain as its friendly protector, guaranteed by the demography and the armed might of the British Indian Army. Now, the Muslim world, as he conceives of it in this vision, is clearly a global figure, and indeed one that is modeled on the British Empire itself. The British Empire as a non-contiguous one, which is dispersed. Again, this goes back to Schmidt, what he calls the English World Empire, which is dispersed across the globe, which has no territorial integrity, and which must therefore be known conceptually by an idea and not by simply the fact of its territorial presence or dispersal. It is known, moreover, by its numbers, by demography, and by cartography. So it's known in a fundamentally sociological way, and not, I want to stress, in a theological way, defining theology for the moment in conventional terms. So this is a vision set against pan-Islamism, which Blunt sees as being the rival model of thinking about Islam's future. And his worry is that Muslims will gravitate towards an Ottoman-centered vision of pan-Islamism based in Constantinople, and in doing so will lose out completely, because Central Asia will be taken, he was right, and the Caucasus will be taken over by Russia, the Mediterranean will be colonized by the southern European countries, the Ottoman Empire will shrink, there's no future there, there's no hope there for Islam. So he sees the Ottoman vision of pan-Islamism as doomed, and his idea of Islam's future, therefore, is dedicated not simply to recognizing something that is meant to happen naturally. It's not meant to happen naturally. Islam, while potentially a subject, is not yet quite a subject, so it needs to be instrumentalized to become what it truly is. Now, this turn to the instrumental, of course, is familiar to us today, because we can't stop hearing narratives about Islam's instrumentalization from everyone. Whether it is the militants of our own day who are meant to be instrumentalizing it falsely, whether it is the West or Western powers that are meant to be instrumentalized. Apparently anyone can instrumentalize Islam. And this idea of instrumentalization, of course, has old roots. It may well go back to the idea of Muhammad, the Prophet himself, as being a heretic who therefore himself is instrumentalizing the truth, or instrumentalizing God, or instrumentalizing religion. Again, in a falsely theological or non-theological manner. So for Blunt, what's interesting is that the vision of pan-Islamism that he's trying to counter by centering Arabia and the protection of the Royal Navy is one that he derives from Napoleon, very intriguing. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, which he thinks makes the kind of instrumentality I've been describing possible for the first time in modern times. That what Napoleon does when he invades Egypt is he tries to claim for himself an Islamic legitimacy by undoing, obviously, the legitimacy of the Caliph in Constantinople, but even more so by undoing the authority of the ulama, of Sufis, of all traditional Muslim authorities in Egypt itself. That Napoleon can lay claim to Islam as a proper name. it's disconnected from all its authorities. It has been depoliticized. He needs to repoliticize it, and he can speak for it and to it directly. And for Blunt, the Ottomans are simply following upon Napoleon's precedent in Egypt. So what we have here then is not only this global vision, demographic and cartographic, sociological vision of the Muslim world limbed onto the British Empire in some ways as a global form. Not only do we have a depoliticized world in which the political element is a European empire and whose center is utterly depoliticized and has to be Arabia, we also have a European power as the only form of agency. France, in this case, Napoleonic conquest, to be followed up by a better, apparently, version of instrumentality, which is Britain, which is meant to be an instrumentality in partnership with Islam itself. So Islam, in other words, represents a potential subject whose future is a problem. How do you make this future happen? And that future can only be made to happen by addressing Islam in its sociological dimension through, as I said, demography and cartography in global terms. Now, I'd like to note here that the globe is the only possible context for such a project, because though we tend to think about everything global and as being big, in fact, it is very narrow and small because it has no outside to it. When you look at an earlier category like the world has an outside. There's this world and the other world, or there are many worlds. When you look at the planet is also part of a much larger, it has an outside, it has a context, it has the solar system and planets beyond. The globe has nothing. It has no context, it has no outside, it has only an inside. And it is in this way a category that is not only radically immanent, or rather one for which transcendence can only be measured in terms of magnitude, sociologically, precisely, but one which is curiously apocalyptic in its very definition. And in other work that I've done, that Tashif was kind enough to mention, I have looked at this with regards to modern Islamic militancy. What does it mean to make the globe your site? And one of the things it means, of course, is that the globe is a site which can have only one subject, humanity, the human race, which is simultaneously its object. So humanity is the potential subject of anything that is global, but it is also the object of the globe insofar as it is put at risk, whether it is through extermination and extinction, whether it is through nuclear war or climate change. And people like Osama bin Laden mention all of these possibilities. And the idea of the Muslim Ummah, the Muslim community, is limbed onto the figure of humanity, which is also a figure, returning to Schmidt, that that defines the English world empire, precisely because it is dispersed territorially. It has no territorial integrity. It can only be thought of in human or humanitarian terms, which is also the way Blunt is thinking about Islam, as a subject, a potential, or a proper name to be saved by the British Empire. Now, all of this context that I've been laying out here, one example of the way in which Islam becomes what I'm calling a proper name, as a historical subject, as an agent in its own right, which I suspect is a modern thing, where you can say Islam wants such and such, Islam does such and such, Islam desires such and such. It becomes an agent, not in theological literature, but in, if you will, secular scholarship. And yet nothing could be more theological in Schmidt's sense than this kind of treatment, hypostasization of Islam. So that real or potential agency or subjectivation of Islam is encapsulated in its name itself. And as early as the late 1950s, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, and I've written about this elsewhere, writes about this, devotes a famous essay to this. How is it that Islam comes to be overwhelmingly present as a subject of this kind? And he looks at that transformation by looking at the titles of books, both the classical collections of Arabic books, but also, in a kind of less systematic way, he looks at modern publications, lists of publications, and he notes that it's only in the 19th century, more precisely from the second half of the 19th century, that Islam becomes a subject of this kind, as a proper name, as a potential or an actual historical subject. Rather than, as he puts it, a verbal noun, it becomes a proper noun, a proper name. So rather than being a verbal noun, which may, for instance, entail, if you will, a political relationship between Muslims and their God, between God and man or humankind, making peace between them, the literal meaning of Islam. Once Islam becomes a proper name, neither Muslims nor God remains a subject. They seem to disappear into it somehow. They are no longer the subjects. It is Islam itself that is a subject. And Smith points out how sociological this name was. And he gives, for instance, the example of book titles in which you have wording, locutions like heresy in Islam, which would have been logically, in his view, impossible. What does it mean to have a title like heresy in Islam, or idolatry in Islam, or something? And that is a result, as it were, of the sociological dimension of that proper name. So what happens is that Islam becomes sociologically a system and precisely not a religion. So we have had a whole tradition of scholarship, which either is, and we heard some of it earlier today, which is either about claiming that Islam is a religion, or as we saw from a previous presentation, looking at H.R. Gibbs' definition of Islam, or for that matter, Marshall Hodgson, it is not a religion. And it's the not a religion part that I'm interested in. In a way, the problem of scholarship, and Negin has said this many times to me, that Islam doesn't fit into religious studies. It doesn't fit into theology departments very well, if at all. Sajjad also, in another way, made this argument in his talk. And one reason I think it doesn't fit is because it is not part of a religion secularism debate. And so I think that tradition, going back to Farzana's, I'm name checking anywhere, every paper, this is not the Assadian narrative of the relationship between the religious and the secular. Because I don't think what's happening with Islam here, how it becomes a proper name and a subject, a historical subject in its own right, real or potential, that story is not the story of religion and secularism. Indeed, some things can get peeled off. You can peel off Sufism and say, okay, we can put that in religious studies. But you can't put Islam in there. And I think one reason why you can't is because it has been formulated, at least in this bipartisan narrative, which is both colonial and, if you will, Muslim, as a system. And again, the H.R. Gibb definition is perfect here. You might call it a civilization. You say it includes law, it includes art, it includes everything. It is systematic. It cannot be defined as religion. And from the 19th century, Muslim thinkers insist on this, though their presuppositions might be a bit different from Blunt, and I'll come to that. So in 1891, just about 10 years after Blunt's book, you have an even more famous book published by an important jurist from Calcutta called Sayyid Amir Ali, and it's called The Spirit of Islam. It is possibly, according to Wilfred Cantwell Smith, by far the most popular book on Islam in any language of the 19th century into the middle of the 20th century. It's translated, it is reprinted endlessly. He wrote it in English first. He was a jurist, but also a historian, famously wrote History of the Saracens, etc. This book, The Spirit of Islam, is, if you will, a polemical riposte to both apologetic Muslim texts, though it is apologetic in its own way, but also to hostile anti-Muslim scholarship, or, if you will, Orientalist scholarship, though it is also Orientalist in its own way. Again, note the title. The fact that you can call this book The Spirit of Islam already tells you Islam is a proper name, is a real or potential subject which has a spirit. And the spirit, I will go on to argue, is the form that agency takes, the agency belonging to this subject. So in this book, towards its very beginning, he actually says something about the proper name. And what he says is that Islam and Christianity alone, of all religions, own their own names. No other religion, certainly not those which end in ism, own their own names. Their names are all given by Orientalists. And when he makes this statement, of course, he is both pairing Christianity and Islam as potential partners, just like Blunt wants to happen, but also as potential rivals, because there can only be one victor. This is not William and Mary we are talking about here. Blunt might have been thinking in those terms. And he does this in order, I think, to displace another kind of narrative in which you relate religions. Let's use the word religion for the moment, which is the narrative of supersession, well known, of course, through Christianity, the way in which Christianity is meant to succeed and yet encapsulate within itself Judaism. So when Islam comes along, what happens? Does Islam simply get to repeat the gesture of Christianity? That's not terribly creative. There are certainly attempts made in that direction. We heard earlier today about Dara Shukro, and arguably that's one of the things Dara is trying to do in his work. There's a supersessionist narrative, because yes, the Upanishads might prefigure the Quran, but like in any good supersessionist narrative, what it does is Muslims looking at the Upanishads can say, it has foretold Muhammad. Muhammad is the fulfillment of it. It's a classical supersessionist narrative. It has nothing to do with tolerance and this liberal stuff. So what Amir Ali is doing is setting up a partnership / rivalry and trying to displace a supersessionist narrative in which Islam can only repeat the foundational act of Christianity, which is supersession. And how could it repeat it except to say we are bigger and better and more successful? And supersession, of course, had been a problem for Christianity ever since the beginning of Islam, because what do you do with your own supersessionist narrative once Islam has emerged? how does Islam fit? Well, that means Muhammad must be a heretic, i.e., going name check Shruti now, i.e., Islam must actually be intimate to Christianity. It must be a perverse form of Christianity. It cannot be other. Unlike Judaism, which is other, though it gives rise to Christianity. Islam can only be a false version of Christianity. And even when you get to the systematic philosophies of people like Hegel, and I'll return to him, Hegel has great difficulty. Where do you place Islam? Eventually, he ends up placing it within the German world between Catholicism and Protestantism, to put it in its proper chronological sequence. And that is also not very satisfying, because Islam nevertheless comes back. In the narrative of supersession, Islam is, as it were, it faces Judaism as a version of Christianity, and it faces Christianity as a version of Judaism. It seems to, as it were, have both sides. And therefore, it puts the narrative of supersession itself into question. And eventually, as you know, in Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel will then go on to suggest that the spirit of Islam, which is the spirit of fanaticism, is perfectly modern, because, of course, the French Revolution and its terror are an instantiation of this spirit. That's Islam all over again. There's nothing traditional about it. To return to Sayyid Amir Ali, he compares Christianity and Islam in this way, and I've just laid out some of the context for that comparison. Yet he might as well, or he could well have said or argued, that named as it was by its sociology, rather than by its founder or by its founding, Islam actually stands with Hinduism. These are the only two major religions not named after a founder in modern scholarship. And in the narrative of Islam as a real or potential subject, and I'll come to this shortly, the figure of the founder, i.e. Muhammad, is increasingly problematic. What you have is a system. With Hinduism, it's caste. You cut off the head of the king. There is no king any longer. There is no politics. You have a system that runs itself. It's an entirely modern conception. It runs itself through caste. It's an acephalous system, or a system in which, again, turning to Shruti, sovereignty is dispersed in the Brahmin, figure of the Brahmin. With Islam, you have a very similar thing happening. Here, the system is law, and it runs Islam, and you can cut off the head of the king. The king is somehow non-essential to Islam. And fidelity, even to the founder, is non-essential. It's a system. It has become a system, whatever its founding was. It somehow can run itself. It can be political. It needn't be political. Because of its ambiguity, it can be instrumentalized. So you can have both the partnership / rivalry of Christian and Muslim, or you can have, if you will, the two religions named by their principle as systems rather than by any point of origin or founding figure or fidelity to a founding figure of that kind. Because, of course, fidelity to a founding figure at least implies some degree of freedom, whereas the system implies none at all. You're trapped within the system. You're trapped within a society of castes, or you're trapped within the Sharia or whatever. And this system, which is made up of all the things that H.R. Gibb mentioned, is defined in functionalist ways by many of these writers, including Sayyid Amir Ali. So the law is there to do X. It's not simply there because God said it should be there or because it embodies some kind of theological principle. It's there for sociological reasons, though it may have other reasons as well. And this, of course, raises the problem of, if you will, human freedom. So Islam is both a sociological object in this sense, and a historical subject or a potential subject. It's whose theological or pseudo-theological character is manifested as spirit, thus the spirit of Islam. It's not enough to have Islam, which is a sociological system. It must have a spirit, because that's where its agency comes from. And that spirit is a bit like a ghost in the machine. You have a machine, in fact. So one of Sayyid Amir Ali's contemporaries, Sayyid Aga Khan, the famous modernist, in an essay on conscience, describes conscience, if you will, as a form of spirit in the following manner. This is the metaphor he gives. A steam engine. You have an engine, it produces steam, the steam pushes it forward. That's the subject and the conscience that drives it. So you see the completely functionless nature of that, of that understanding. But of course, to speak of the spirit of Islam is to gesture towards a whole set of texts and thinkers in Europe, from, let's say, Montesquieu's Spirit of the Law to Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Hegel is particularly important for Indian thinkers in this period, in any case. So what kind of relationship is possible with such a subject, now that I've tried to lay it out, this strange subject that is also an object, this sociological object that might be a subject defined by spirit as its agency? How can you as a believer relate to such a thing, Islam rendered into a subject of this kind? It reminds me of that famous, in some quarters, Sajjad, I'm sure will know this, anecdote by Kierkegaard about Hegel, the great system maker of the 19th century, where he says, well, it's all very well that Hegel has a great system which explains everything. Everything can be put in the system. It's a historical system. But the thing about the system maker is, this is a paradox. The system maker constructs a palace, but has to live outside it in a shack. Because, of course, to see the system, you can only be outside it, yet your system precludes the possibility of anyone being outside it. So that's a kind of joke. I don't want to take it very far, but just to note the problem posed by the rendering of Islam into a system that is also a proper name, an object that is also a subject. How do you relate to such a subject? And what happens to God and the Prophet, say, within it? So this problem goes well beyond the scholarly problem that has been addressed with the making of Islam as, if you will, a colonial category, which is to say, the competition between traditional and modern authorities to own it. It's always a problem of ownership. So do the ulama get to own it? Do the Sufis get to own it? Do the modernists get to own it? Do the Islamists get to own it? And anyone else who comes along. Now, I find it interesting that ownership gets to be the language in which this relationship is construed. And I think that's crucial because, of course, the language of ownership, which is also the language of capital, and therefore, in some sense, the language of modernity, comes to define relations of this kind, especially with this strange hybrid subject/object. But the ownership is never clear, not only because of the competition, which I have mentioned, but also because it's entirely ambiguous whether this is a subject or an object we're talking about, whether you're part of it or outside it, and whether you possess it or are possessed by it. So not to be too abstruse, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. The epistemological and, if you will, theological stakes of this problem of relationship, I think, are evident in the problem of relating Muhammad, the historical founding figure of Islam, to Islam as this system and proper name, which I was describing. Is he, i.e. Muhammad, Islam's subject or its object? Is he merely human or semi-divine? That's another way of asking that question. What you see in the second half of the 19th century is this, certainly in South Asia, possibly in other parts of the world, the increasing popularity of Muhammad as a figure of Muslim devotion and attention and writing, matched by the increasing insistence that he's nothing more than a human being, that he should be stripped of theological attributes and miraculous powers. And I think this is really a fascinating development, which I want to address. Because it seems to me that in this world of the proper name and the subject that is also an object, Muhammad becomes impossible as a founding figure. And indeed, Muslims like Sayyid Ahmad Khan and Sayyid Amir Ali are keen not to make him a founding figure of this kind. He's, of course, a great exemplar and a teacher and all the rest, but he must be stripped of his agency because, of course, that is to, in their view, suggest that Muhammad is the kind of heretical figure, instrumentalizing figure of earlier Christian narrative who invented the whole thing called Islam. But quite apart from their motives in doing so, I think stripping Muhammad of his agency in this way is very interesting in view of the agency or the super agency given to Islam itself. He cannot have it, it must have it. So in some ways, Muhammad as a founder, that is to say as an agent, becomes irrelevant or must be killed to become a totemic but unassimilable figure who forever interrupts the system, who returns to haunt it. And it is here that we see the importance of the shift from Mohammedanism to Islam as a term. Blunt, remember, uses Islam, and he's somewhat unusual in this period. Even H.A.R. Gibb I think, has a book called Mohammedanism, so much later. And Muslims themselves, certainly in South Asia, were happy to use the term Mohammedan for themselves, apparently. And they are, as it were, pre-colonial versions of the Tariqa Muhammadiyah, the famous reform/jihad movement against the Sikhs and then the East India Company. But Mohammedanism must go. Muhammad must be stripped of his agency as a founder, and Islam is the only thing that is the only subject, is the only figure that has agency. So Muhammad, in a curious way, has no freedom and therefore has no politics in this narrative. It is Islam that is the only agent, but it's closed. It's a closed system. It has been depoliticized. It can only be instrumentalized, though it always awaits its subjectivation. So the Prophet's humanization in some ways marks the loss of his theological status, while at the same time making him vulnerable to insult as a Muslim possession. And this, of course, is a now very famous phenomenon. It's, shall I dare say it, South Asia or Indian Islam's gift. It's a terrible gift, a gift to the world of Islam, which is to say controversies over Muhammad and whether he can be depicted or criticized. And this country, of course, has been at the center from 1989 with the Rushdie affair of these increasingly global controversies. They begin in India, as all bad things do. And I think they begin there partly because Muhammad has been humanized, he has been de-theologized in a way, and he becomes vulnerable because he has become a Muslim possession. Here, the question of property arises again. So let me give you a couple of examples of how this comes to be. The earliest controversies over insults to Muhammad that I can find of this distinctly modern kind are from Bombay, 1851 and 1874. They're very interesting because they occur in a colonial city at the heart of Indian capitalism. This is a city with no tradition. It didn't exist before colonialism. It's built by the British and of course their Indian subjects. Both these controversies of 1851 and 1874. 1851 is about, both have to do with newspapers, again, important and interesting. These are not theological texts. Owned by Parsis, one of which prints a kind of Orientalist account of Muhammad in its series of like great founding figures of religion. The other 1874 controversy or riot, both result in riots in which many are killed, also has to do with a Parsi-owned newspaper, this time with an image of Muhammad. The objection is not to the image. The objection is to the fact that the image has been misprinted in such a way that there's a mark on the face of Muhammad. And there are riots which are construed then as being Muslim Parsi riots. So I want to note a few things here which will tell us, I hope, something about the novelty of these controversies. One, I've already said, they take place in the public sphere of a colonial city. There's nothing traditional about them. Secondly, they are about the press and about circulation, the anonymous circulation of stories. They are not about theological wrangles and disputes. Those are happening in North India between Hindus and Muslims. The Arya Samaj, and Muslim groups wrangling in theological debates. This has nothing to do with theology. This is super modern. It's about the press. It's about an anonymous audience. It's not about Hindus. It's about Parsis. So there is no, as it were, tradition from Upper India of enmity, religious enmity here. And there are no debates. There is no theological debate at all. The theological elements are introduced by the colonial commentary. And what happens in effect is the controversy has to do with possession and ownership in a market, in the new public sphere of a colonial city construed as a market. That is what all the debate is about. If you will, it's about use or exchange value. Is the Prophet to be owned and possessed and controlled by Muslims as their possession in a form of use value, or can his image and his story circulate anonymously? With nothing particularly horrible necessarily being said about it. Now, the debate as it, before the riot, during the riot, and after the riots, has to do, as happens again in 1989 with the Rushdie affair and all subsequent events of this kind, with free speech. Where are the lines of free speech to be drawn? The Muslim objectors do not object to free speech. What they do is say, well, no speech is absolutely free, that there are parameters for free speech. It's exactly today's argument, in other words. It hasn't changed at all since the middle of the 19th century, which is a bit boring. What they want, free speech, of course, is also a marketized category. It's like free trade. It's governed by the same rules. You have free speech, you have free trade. In both cases, you have some parameters. You're not allowed to trade in unlicensed things, and you're not allowed to trade like in weapons that might kill unless you're an American. So here, the Muslim objections have to do with the parameters of free speech, which are what? Libel, defamation. That is it. There is not one theological argument being mounted here. Indeed, the term blasphemy, which is used for these riots of 1851 and 1874 and all subsequent ones is a Christian language of blasphemy. Blasphemy, that term, that English term. Whereas the Muslims who are objecting are using libel, defamation, and even in later years, copyright. So the latest or the most recent of the Pakistani anti-Ahmadi laws have to do with the Prophet as a possession of the Muslim community, and therefore the refusal to allow Ahmadis to invoke the Prophet is drawn from the law of copyright. It's not drawn from Sharia. That's what the Pakistani court does. And Humaira can tell us more about it. So you have theology coming in through Christianity by, as it were, the side. And the Muslim debate is entirely different. It uses, of course, terms for insult. Just yesterday, I was looking at a Pakistani poster. You know, the Pakistani Prime Minister is trying to survive a vote of no confidence. In doing so, of course, he has to resort to invocations of the Prophet. And one of these posters said something about, he's called the Hurmat Rasul Ka Pasban, right? The guardian of the honor of the Prophet. That is why you must repose your confidence in him. But these are the words that are used. Hurmat is actually not so common, but Tawheen, Gustakhi, and Namus. So insult and honor, which can be theological terms, but are also perfectly ordinary, profane ones, and can be used of ordinary people. There is a theological register, which others in this room know much better than I do, but it is rarely invoked in these, from the 1850s to today, in these disputes and in these controversies. Now, obviously, these riots, and I don't want to spend too much time on them, involve many other things. They involve class, they involve sects, they involve, all kinds of things. Language groups, competition, that is part of their sociology, and I can come back to that if you're interested. What I wanted to foreground is their relative novelty and modernity, and their concern with circulation and markets and ownership, and the absence of any inherited theological language to describe them. The last point I want to make on this issue has to do with the equally globalized, now globalized language of hurt sentiments, which characterizes objections to insults delivered the Prophet. That comes directly from the Indian Penal Code, directly, as authored by Lord Macaulay. So it's in the drafting stages, I think in the 1840s, I think it's made into law in the 1860s. And Lord Macaulay in the Indian Penal Code does not put in a blasphemy provision, because the Indian Penal Code is not meant to have one. It's meant to be an enlightened constitutional document, unlike Britain, which had, until Tony Blair's later years in government as Prime Minister, a blasphemy law, which applied mostly to the Church of England, as we know from the Rushdie affair. There too, when Muslims objected, they had to invoke a Christian category and a Christian law of blasphemy to justify themselves. They had no theological justification from Islamic materials. So you have this curious situation in which the language of ownership, property, and possession dominates, and markets dominates this way of thinking about Muhammad, who has been stripped of his theological virtues, or somewhat stripped. And then you have the language of hurt sentiments from Macaulay and the Indian Penal Code, which of course also suggests that the one offended is no longer Muhammad, but the Muslim who possesses him, who owns him. So it's ownership and the owner, as it were. So at this point, one can get into, but I will spare you, a discussion of Locke and self-possession and ownership and all the rest. And I'll come to my conclusion. And start off by saying that the non-theological nature of this argument, in which it is Islam that is the subject, the Prophet is problematic because he cannot be, he has to be stripped of his agency and robbed of his theological status. All this is also clear in the controversy over the Ahmadis. I've just referred to it, others referred to it earlier today. And let me just briefly give you Iqbal, since Iqbal has tiresomely come up all day today, Iqbal's view on this. And for him, it's a post-metaphysical issue, right? So what does he say? He says the Ahmadis are wrong, not simply because they're Ahmadis. They represent the ulama. They represent the traditional learned classes because they believe in all this theological stuff. They are simply the vanguard of the Muslim theological classes in general. He explicitly says so, certainly in his letter to Nehru, his response to Nehru, and in other anti-Ahmadi writings. The problem with them, apart from his vision, that his view that they depoliticize Islam by being pro-British, is that they refuse to understand the principle of the finality of prophecy, which for him also is the alternative to the narrative of supersession. So with Amir Ali, it's this kind of strange partnership. With Iqbal, it's finality, that how Islam succeeds Christianity is not by being bigger and better than it. It's by saying, we put a close to this this metaphysical period. From now on, we have human freedom. The Prophet, he says, stands with one foot in the ancient world and the other is a kind of colossus straddling it, with one foot in the ancient world and the other foot in the modern world. And he belongs to the past insofar as he's a prophet, by the way. He's consigned to history. Insofar as he self-abrogates prophecy, he belongs to the future. Because in doing so, he sets human beings free. And humanity can become an agent in its own right, just like and through the Muslim community, which is humanity writ small. And therefore, if you will, Islam becomes a subject in its own right. He makes the same argument, which no one ever talks about, with regards to the Shiite, the 12th Imam. And he says there too, if it's the Sunnis, it's the finality of prophecy that sets people free, Muslims free. With the Shiites, it is the occultation of the 12th Imam, which sets human beings free, because as long as the Imam is not there, you cannot instantiate a perfect society. You are perforce and by default free until the Messiah returns. So whether you're approaching it from the figure of the Imam or you're approaching it from the figure of the Prophet, you have, as it were, human freedom as an interregnum between these two, if you will, theological moments. And that is why he is against not just the Ahmadis, but the Ahmadis, as I keep saying, as the vanguard of all traditional so-called Muslim leadership. Ulama, Sufis, everyone. So now, it's an interesting argument that Iqbal is making. But let me return to, and then conclude, to the passions that are associated with these riots and controversies over insults to the Prophet, which, as I said, have very little, if any, theological language that is part of them. Does the gap between the everydayness and the humanity of Muhammad and the outrage at his insult, there's a gap there, right? Because the Prophet, on the one hand, is just like us. We are insulted because he's, as from the Rushdie affair, people are saying, but you see this even in the earlier these 1850s and 1870s riots, people are saying, oh, he's like our relative. And he's like, of course I would feel offended. He has become your possession in some ways, either as a relative or some other way. That's fine, you can feel offended. But the gap between that form of very quotidian, everyday offense and riots and violence is still noticeable, because it tends not to happen when your relatives have been insulted. So what's going on? And I wonder whether we see in that gap, in the de-theologized character of the prophet, the negative presence of the theological, which has no name. It is that empty space which cannot be named, but which, as it were, does the work of the theological, but only by violence, precisely because it cannot be named. But if the prophet can be insulted because he's like us, he's very much like us, God remains a theological figure outside Islam as a system and a proper name. He doesn't get insulted. No one goes on, no one riots over insults to God. Itself a kind of interesting fact. And I would assume it's because he still remains outside, he's still a theological figure. He still remains outside this system of the proper name. And indeed, he is known not by invocation people close to us, like our relatives, but by figures who notionally are completely opposed to him or unlike him. So Sajjad was mentioning poetry, including Bedil, but of course in poetry, as far as I can tell of this tradition, God is best named by being described as a woman, as an infidel, and as an idol, and never, in fact, it would be sinful to compare God to men and your relatives and things like that. But it is perfectly all right he's only, if you will, his transcendence is such that he can only be known by what he's explicitly not. I don't know, I might be entirely wrong there. So in some ways, God represents the dissolution of Islam as this proper name, as this system, with which one must either identify in the sense of owning it, or which must own one, which must possess one. So I use the word possession in both its senses here. You're possessed by love for the prophet, that you're driven to do extraordinary things. You're literally possessed, like Sir Sayed's steam engine. You have steam coming out, like a cartoon, steam coming out of your ears. In this sense, God represents the apocalypse that Iqbal thought was forestalled by the occultation of the Imam. And yet, today there are moves to own even God in the way that the prophet has been owned, by reducing him to a proper name and a Muslim possession. In Indonesia, reference to our Indonesian presentation, entirely coincidental, the controversies are, of course, whether Christians can use the word Allah, which has been made into a proper name, as opposed to the word for God. And of course, in Pakistan, famously Allah Hafiz, as opposed to Khuda Hafiz, where Khuda is not good enough for various reasons. Might be Shiite, it's Persian, it's who knows whose God it can be. We have to have our God, and he has a name, and it's called Allah. Again, in both cases, Allah has become a proper name, like you and I in some ways, and not a theological figure. So even there, you have the extension of the logic of the proper name, in which both the prophet and possibly God get fitted back into Islam as the only subject, which acts as a pseudo-theological subject. And I wonder whether, therefore, in an Iqbalian vein, but unlike anything I hope he would say, the triumph of Islam as a proper name, as a subject of this kind, really means the death of God. And yet, in a way that has nothing to do with what I began with, the two narratives of secularization, either the return of religion narrative or the secularization of theological categories. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faisal, for that incredibly rich, but also wide-angled talk in which you also managed to squeeze in all of our presenters and papers from today. So thank you very much. I think there are plenty of questions actually in the audience. I might just start off with one. I was struck by of course, the language of honor and insult that's used to describe it. You made the link between that language and familial language, the language of someone close to you. And I'm wondering what do we make of this familial language in general, and how does this relate to the broader language around fraternity and brotherhood that's also saturating Islamic thought, right? I mean, when we think about brotherhood in the 20th century, you also think about the Muslim brotherhood. You think about that's the Ikhwan is one of the ways in which Muslims relate to each other. So could you say a little bit more about, the familial language that seems to permeate this system, but also how then the family itself becomes obsessive site for many Islamist thinkers such as Maududi, right? So what's going on with the family, I guess, on the different registers here? And then we'll take some questions after that. And just when you are asking a question, just please wait for the microphone.
Thanks very much, Taushif. Yes, that's an interesting question. I mean, in the context of the South Asian and now increasingly European controversies over Muhammad, the language of brotherhood is deployed violently. So again, if we go back to violent fraternity in some ways, because the brotherhood is invoked to kill and to punish. And if you will, it is a claim to sovereignty of a certain kind. Fraternal, in this sense, perhaps even republican, in the name precisely of, classically, of a martyred, insulted founder, the father figure, Muhammad, who can also be an uncle, of course. In London, it's in Luton, they're like my uncle, okay? But in any case, someone of an older generation, never your generation. So there you have the kind of very interesting refraction, I guess, of very basic Republican theory. The cutting off the head of the king, the founder or the father, the brotherhood of the sons who create a polity. And so I think that's where brotherhood comes in that context. But not in all of it. I'm just sticking to the riots and the controversies of Muhammad. Maududi, of course, has for him, the family is the building block of Muslim society and of the state. He, of course, is very interested primarily in the role of women in that society. And him, what's interesting is, again, like his contemporary and someone whom he actually wrote an admiring biography of, Gandhi, he tries to think about society in terms of non-competition. So for Gandhi, it's caste and indeed religion, that people should do different things but not compete with each other. It's a kind of weird division of labor argument. With Maududi, gender works in that logic. So men and women should be partners but not compete with each other. The family has to be depoliticized. So it's a foundation, yet it's an anti-political foundation. Because you have to displace the political relationship elsewhere. And that thing has to be policed, in an extraordinary manner, because of course it always threatens to erupt, and it always threatens to erupt because the moment you make the family the basis of your polity, there is the political must manifest itself in the familial. So you can't both have it as your basis and depoliticize it at the same time. And in a way, this takes me back to the larger depoliticizations I started my talk with, which is of Islam itself, or the Muslim community, or the Muslim world itself, with its ultimate depoliticized center being.
So we'll take many questions. So I'm going to take them in clusters, if that's all right. So we'll start with Daryush, and then Sam, and then Shruti and Farzana and Umaira.
Thank you, Faisal. So let me take it back this time again to Iran. So when the Iranian Revolution happened, Khomeini started with this idea of this beloved Islam, Islam Aziz. Now, the funny thing was that all, apart from the clergymen and the people, the 12 Shiites who were looking at this savior, the Islam, the vague Islam, there were all these communist and socialist groups who were rallying behind this extremely vague thing, which it took them, I think, 4 or 5 years to realize how horrendous and how terrifying that Islam Aziz, that vague Islam could be. But then they started with this vague Islam, which, called proper noun. And then after 40 years, something very, very strange has happened with this one. It is utterly and thoroughly secularized Islam. Because if you look at the functioning of how things are happening in Iran, almost everything is secular about it. And I don't know who wrote this. I think that somebody was arguing that when Khomeini was developing the idea, the theory of the governance of the jurist, he was basically cutting off the umbilical cord of ethics from Islam. So that Islam became something completely soulless, it became something secular, it became nothing other than this Leviathan, which was just in the service of power, of pure brute power. So the real question I'm going to ask you is that do you think that this idea of turning Islam into a proper noun is removing anything from its vagueness, or is it adding more ambiguity to it? Or we are still confused around this idea that nobody knows what exactly this vague thing is?
Thank you for this excellent talk. How might we think about theological religious ownership within the Lockean frame? In other words, who owns the prophet? Is it Allah that owns the prophet that owns himself, or is it the Ummah that owns the prophet? I guess, do any of us really ever own ourselves? And is there actually also a limit? For example, in Locke, there's a prohibition on suicide. We don't own ourselves to the point where we can dispose of ourselves. We have to leave over as much as good. But I also was wondering about kind of the big arc of your talk, which was excellent. And this is kind of a Schmidt question. When does Islam finally knock out the discourse which refers to the religion and its adherents via synecdoche of the name of the prophet? So Schmidt, for example, still refers to, in quotes, Mohammedan, even in 1981. And what does it mean? I guess you actually would know this better. What does it mean for him to keep that older discourse, which the discourse of Islam knocks out?
So I think we'll take one more. Maybe I think Farzana had her hand up, and then we'll take another cluster.
Sorry, I was still trying to formulate my question, but I'll Faisal, wonderful talk. Just very briefly. While I was listening to you, I was thinking that this process of transformation, whereby Islam comes to represent proper name, a radical shift, led me to wonder what all this might have to do with what it means to be a Muslim today. Because when you think that key notions in Islamic thinking, such as restraint and sabr, are no longer part of this lexicon, and that today, unless one is outraged, unless one is capable of demonstrating a total loss of control, you are a lesser Muslim than your neighbor. And so it seems to me that the transformation is not just Islam, but also what has happened to the meaning of a Muslim.
No, that's fine. Well, thank you all very much. Dariush, yes, I mean, I was very interested if you know, Khomeini, Islam Aziz, of course, that is, it is a kind of personalization. I mean, you normally say that of a person. And so in that sense, it plays into my argument. But I also think that, again, others who know much more about this, you know much more about this than I do, that with Khomeini, you know, one of the big differences compared to, say, the Sunni Islamists is there is no refusal of political. There's no attempt to somehow displace it. And in that famous argument he has with Khamenei about the, if you will, the dominance of the Sharia, and you will certainly know this, where Khomeini counters Khamenei and says, no, it is not the Sharia that will define in each and every case what needs to be done, but the interests of the Iranian nation or the Iranian people. And so sovereignty is located in the state. And so unlike Maududi, who wants to vanish away sovereignty altogether and displace it entirely, it belongs to God, it cannot be owned by man. With Khomeini, you actually have a fulsome approbation of sovereignty and of the Iranian, he himself, I guess, the supreme leader as the sovereign figure, to the extent that you can displace explicit Sharia rulings, temporarily perhaps. And there the logic of exception seems to work quite differently from Schmitt, because there it is the, if you will, the instead of the exception being an exception to a norm of human flourishing, where the exception is what calls for sacrifice and all the rest. In the Iranian case, it's almost as if the exception is where, if you will, human flourishing emerges. The exception is not the sacrificial, violent element. The exception, the sovereign exception that Khomeini elaborates, is all about the flourishing of Iran and her citizens. So the contrast between norm and exception, as I understand Schmitt describes it, is quite different. So I think that really changes things here. So you seem to have an exit clause in Khomeini, where you might have this Maududi-like stuff happening in some respects, but it's very, very limited. But you know much more about it than I do. The thing about ambiguity and clarity, of course, the ambiguity is fundamental, which is why the problem becomes a problem. That you're never in a position where Islam really fully becomes subjectivized. How can it? That little quip, Kierkegaard's quip that I repeated. So you're always on a kind of continuum there, and the ambiguity is of the essence of that problem. It's not one that can ever be resolved. On Sam, yeah, that's fascinating. What is the lineage of ownership here? Who owns who? I hadn't thought about it, but you're right. So you could, I suppose, say, yes, God owns the prophet. The prophet owns, I don't know, Muslim believers. But the prophet can also haunt and possess Muslim believers. He can appear in their dreams. To say that of God and the prophet might be a bit taking a bit too much of a chance. because then you get into the whole question of the semi-divine status of the prophet, which is exactly what these people want to push aside. But so the chain of ownership, I think, is really fascinating, and I would have to think about it. On Mohammedan, yeah, I mean, if I were to, for the moment, deploy the Badiouin term of fidelity to, okay, we talk about fidelity to an event. The event might be the founding of Islam with Muhammad. So it should be a fidelity. So let's say Badiou on St. Paul as this kind of founding figure. So Muhammad, that is a remarkably freeing vision, in my view. A fidelity to a founding figure, whether or not you see them as founding in a historical sense or not, does not constrain you in a system which must at the same time be its own kind of subject. And it makes many more things possible. And I wonder whether Schmidt or indeed others use the term Mohammedan in that way. Certainly when Indian Muslims in colonial times use Muhammad of themselves. They're not simply citing colonial usage. Often they may, like Sayyid Aga Khan's college is called the Anglo-Mohammedan, Oriental Anglo-Mohammedan College. It's a funny term, Anglo-Mohammedan, Oriental, all of it packaged together. But there it's not a citation necessarily. It's not being said for the benefit of the colonial master. It's an ownership of another kind. It's an acknowledgement. Because the thing about that college, of course, it is meant to transform scholarship, not only to make it modern, but to rethink Kalam, the theology itself, the theological, it's central to its project, even though, of course, Sayyid Ahmad Khan's tafsir of the famous tafsir of the Quran is not taught in his own college because it's seen as being too extreme or something. So, in a way, the name Mohammedan is used, for instance, in the college, yes, you might have the presumption of a system and all the rest. But if you're using Mohammedan and not Islam, maybe certain new possibilities get opened up there. But that's not necessarily always the case. Very often Mohammedan is used in a non-theological sense. That is to say, Indian and Islam is rarely used like that. So you would say, when the franchise is expanded in India and you have separate electorates and you have constituencies with a Mohammedan and Hindu or non-Mohammedan or whatever, people have, like Jinnah, stood from a constituency in Bombay, which is urban Mohammedan. That's how it was classified, right? So, so it had to be, whether it's rural or urban, and what the religious electorate was that he stood for. And there is no theological element in that use of Muhammad. And when he uses Muhammadan for himself, he also doesn't imply, so there's a way in which there's something quite liberating in the use of the term Muhammadan. And possibly also in its Urdu forms. But I couldn't, there's no way I can say for the entirety of all these usage. But Islam is different because it does come to name a system, it does come to be a proper name. Muhammad, of course, is a proper name as well. But it doesn't bear that theological weight or the displacement of the theological weight. Which brings me to Farzana. So there too, I think you're right. I was thinking when you were speaking, Akbar Ilhabadi has a famous poem from 1919, when the Khilaf movement begins. And it's a set of verses that are put together and published only posthumously, in fact, in the 1940s by his son. And it's called the Gandhi Nama, and it begins, the days of the Shah Nama are over, now that the Gandhi Nama begins. And it's about republicanism, it's about freedom, not kings, in other words. And he makes merciless fun of Gandhi in the Gandhi-Nama, among other things, because he's a comic poet, he's a satirical poet as well. But one of the things he says about Gandhi and about the non-cooperation movement, which brings together Hindus and Muslims in Khilafat, is when Gandhi talks about non-cooperation and ahimsa, what he's talking about is sabr, virtue, fortitude, the other way, the other terms you could use for it, let's say fortitude. And he says how different this is from the kind of Islam, that this is actually what is Islamic about Gandhi. And Sabra, he might as well have knocked in Intezar and then you have a Shiite. But he explicitly counters it with the reliance on passion, jazbat. And why am I always forgetting her name? Our friend in Germany, Margaret Pernod, who works on conceptual emotions, history of emotions, who tells us how precisely in this period, the language of jazbat comes into being as a good thing. It would have been utterly alien and foreign in the past. But this is what marks a good Muslim, that you give vent to your emotions, your love for the Prophet, the chief among them. So it's love, violent love. And so my argument, of course, was that this language of jazbat serves as the empty space of the theological. Its excessive nature names what doesn't have a name. If you were to have the theological, you wouldn't have it, just as God does not invite violence. So it's the unnamed and the empty space of the theological. I wonder, I can
So
only
it's no
wonder.
longer enough to recite the kalma. You have to be able to express outrage
Yeah.
to be defined as a Muslim.
But it's outrage, but remember, it's always given the name of love. That's the interesting thing about it. Now, you could do a take on Sabah Mahmood's version of this, right, where she says that everything is about love. These women in the mosque are, training themselves in bodily comportment out of desire to whatever, to repeat the teachings of the past, and the love. She never goes down the road of violence, where that is the most obvious road of all, with the kind of love that she's writing about. So I find it very unsatisfying. She was a friend of mine, but apart from other things that are unsatisfying about that book and others, this is one of them, that she doesn't seem to realize the historical context in which this language of love proliferates, and that it can't just come directly from with some text to your body, and you're reading this text in the mosque and remaking yourself as a pious Muslim subject.
Okay, so Shruti and then Humaira. Shruti and then Humaira, and then we'll take two from here.
Okay, thank you, Faisal. You've given us a lot to think, particularly about social theory rather than Islam for me. So actually, thought came to me, reminded me of Foucault, actually, with you, that Foucault makes this point that the minute you have a division between philosophy and theology, that's the time the West loses futurity and it only has disciplinary power. And I was thinking that maybe that's exactly why the Prophet is not brought back, as it were, the figure of the Prophet by someone like Iqbal, because anti-colonialism demands futurity. So that was something I wanted to ask you about. Those who are interested in Islam, this division is at the center of, as it were, according to Foucault, 10th century. I'll take his word for it. That division takes place. And so for him, in a way, the West loses politics, properly speaking, and it has only sovereignty as discipline and bodily the rest, and therefore you can then have knowledges which you catalog and classify and the rest. So I was just interested whether the Prophet actually belongs to that debate too, where it is about futurity through that. But other question was actually about Napoleon contra Warren Hastings, because of course Warren Hastings too invokes Islam, but only superficially in the clothing, and as a kind of way of, making himself a natural ruler of South Asia. But the constitutional work is, to do the chief constitutional work, is just it's nameless. It could be Hindu, it could be anything, but it's not Muslim. That's what is clear. So I was interested in this kind of superficiality, depth, to a place like Britain and Islam and South Asia in the conquest of South Asia. It's easier for Napoleon to claim it, as it were, in one sense. But I was interested in the superficiality of clothing and Hastings, which he continues for these 50 years, plus language, but not the law.
Thank you, Faisal. That was really rich, and there are many questions. I guess I'll try and stick to two. The first one is really kind of thinking through the specificity of Islam in this context. So in some ways, the process that you've defined and detailed in really exciting detail is a process that we see happening with many other religious traditions, right? It is the process of what I think of as secularization, not in terms of the division of the political and the theological, not in terms of a spatial public-private division, but really as a transformation of political imagination and thinking about, precisely as you discussed, the displacement of something that cannot be named anymore. But I was thinking about what then is specific to Islam in this context, if we think about this, because we have seen this happen within other religious traditions as well. Now, one of the things that you point out is the relationship. First of all, Islam as an entity has agency, and that agency comes at the expense of something else, like Muhammad. Muhammad has agency, Allah doesn't have agency. But so I guess two questions. One is, what are the parallels, perhaps staying within, say, the South Asian context or the Indian context? Are there parallels with other traditions within the Indian context of something losing agency to become Hinduism or to become Sikhism or to become Jainism? What loses agency in that context? And the second question was really triggered by something you said, when you have, when it's a system of caste or it's a system of laws, it is much more rigid. And actually part of me entirely agrees with that. But I was also thinking, one of the things that you described, and I can see, with Amir Ali, with all of these reformist Muslims, there is this battle over the essence of Islam. So what is the essence of Islam? And actually once it becomes a proper noun, and once we associate that proper noun with having an essence, actually the battleground shifts. So the battleground becomes, what is the essence? And then you have all these debates about, no, the essence of Islam is not this, it is that, no, the essence of Islam is that. So I'm just curious about why you think this is a more rigid cage, just to spell that out a bit more, because actually it seems continuously open to interpretation as well. It's not as if interpretation, the role of interpretation goes away. So what is more rigid about this particular movement? Thank you.
We'll take two from here. I think it was right with Bruce. I don't know who it's Kushi.
Thank you, Dr. Faisal, for recognizing me with this ninja, mask. Very wonderful presentation. Dr. Faisal, my question is about the book which you mentioned, The Future of Islam. You said that was published in 1882. And a few years, almost 25 years before that, in 1857, Muslims actually started to question their identity, and they started to actually defend their identity as Muslims. And then you mentioned the publication of this the figure of Prophet Muhammad in 1874, and it ended in riots. So Muslims in that period, when this book, The Future of Islam, was published, Muslims were already questioning their Muslim identity. I'm just wondering, when the writer, I think his name was Blunt?
Blunt, yeah.
Blunt, when he published this book, and he gave this idea, proposed this idea that British should save Islam. How did Muslims, especially ulama in subcontinent, react to? How did they react to this idea that the people who are colonizing them can save them? They can save their faith. I'm just wondering this. Thank you.
Final question.
Thank you, Dr. Faisal. My name is Mohammed Ramazan. I'm a PhD student at City University London and a research associate at King Faisal Centre for Research and Islamic Studies. I do have a set of questions. I'll begin on the first set. How does Islam...
Can we just keep it to one question, actually? We're
Of
running
course.
out of time. Thanks.
How does Islam, how shall Islam be conceptualized? Shall it be understood as religious text, or shall it be understood as being a practice of believer and in itself as a religion? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah, should be. That's very interesting about futurity. I suppose, as I was saying, with the making of the Muslim world in a global context, when the globe becomes explicit as a context with no outside, then futurity becomes it can only be either the complete subjectivation of Islam, the Muslim community, or the human race, when it is routinely paired in this period. Because I've written about this elsewhere. The fact that the British make demography into the defining basis of their Islamic legitimacy, as opposed to the Ottoman Sultan. Right? The Ottomans can say, well, we are Cadians and all the rest, and the British say, we have more Muslims. Therefore, we are the greatest Mohammedan power. We are the most legitimate because we have more. So it's a sociological, demographic, and also cartographic understanding. And that, of course, is popularized among Muslims themselves, among many Muslims themselves. And it also becomes then part of the, if you will, British imperial narrative in which humanity is foregrounded as the ultimate subject of its own endeavors, but of the globe itself. So the constant pairing of the Muslim community and Islam with the human race. And people like Iqbal and Azad, name check, Amar, are constantly banging on about this. Right? The human race, humanity, Islam is all about this, etc. So either you have full subjectivation in this sense, or you have apocalypse. Because if you don't have the full subjectivation, then you have utter ruination and extinction and all that. So, in a way, what's interesting is, with Iqbal, when he has this, the way he deals with the 12th Imam, as long as we don't have him back, as long as he's in occultation, we have freedom. It's a constant, the future is always being forever deferred. And that's the point of, so, and that's also one reason to go back to your talk. You don't want an ending. So he doesn't have an apocalyptic vision in that sense, so you don't have an ending, you have an eternal present, but that means you don't have much of a futurity either. So
you don't think prophet is related to futurity, even though you yourself, you've all used that quote of the prophet belonging to these two worlds, right? Which is why he's critiquing Spengler and all of the rest. So
the prophet is an inaugural moment, so he opens up something,
right.
But you don't really have an end point. That of course would be apocalyptic in another sense, not in the sense of extinction of either the defeat of Islam and the extinction of the human race. There you have God as the figure of apocalypse, or the Messiah. But then you would need another kind of theological language for it. I guess apocalypse in the sense of utter destruction is a kind of secularized, to go to Humera's question, form of apocalypse. And indeed, our worries about both nuclear apocalypse is back with us, thanks to the Ukrainian war, but climate change as well. These are secularized forms. They bring apocalypse back to life in a pseudo-theological way for the first time in a long time, from the Cold War to our days. So, there is a kind of, if you will, pseudo-apocalypse built into this way of thinking that I've been describing. About the instrumentality, I find that interesting, and as you know, I attribute it to the kind of insufficient subjectivity of Islam. The language of instrumentalization, as I said, is extraordinary when you think about it. I know of no other religion in which you have that much emphasis in the scholarship and in journalism on instrumentality. It's always Islam. It's like, why is it this religion seems to offer itself to be instrumentalized so consistently? Clearly, it's not true. It's just there's another kind of displacement going on here, and it's about insufficient subjectivity. Something that, going back to what I just said about these strange British fantasies about being the greatest Mohammedan power, the world's greatest Mohammedan power. That is, if you will, another form of the Warren Hastings, because they have no intention of.
Yeah, that's exactly the point.
It's entirely superficial, but it's entirely sociological as well. So the only theological element is a secular element, which is to say freedom of conscience. So that is what the British Empire promises you. You're free to practice your religion, whatever it is. And if you're free to protect your religion, to practice your religion, that is the only way in which, if you will, the theological element enters into this narrative in terms of liberty. And there too, you have Muslims in colonial India who really go run with this story and who even contest the British on the basis of it. So it's something I've been writing more recently, and I gave this talk at Sajjad and Noman's seminar that they run at Habib University in Karachi. The Khilafatists who are arguing that Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali are arguing that for their constitutional rights, if you will, on the basis of the Queen's Proclamation of 1858, which guaranteed religious freedom to Hindus and Muslims and partnership, that they are being deprived of their rights, that they are in fact loyal subjects. They have these rights, and this is the only way in which it comes in. And Muhammad Ali, at his famous trial for sedition in 1921, says as much, that I am not making the case. In a Muslim country, I would make another case. He says, I make the case for Sharia. In a non-Muslim country, I cannot make that case. My case has to be a secular case, and this is it. It's so there, but it's the instrumentalizing nature of it, to which Islam, as this new kind of category, is consistently subjected, that I find fascinating. Secularize Humera. I agree. I mean, I think one of the things that Iqbal does is, and I've written about it elsewhere, is he shifts from space to time. So whereas we're used to thinking about secularism in spatial terms, private and public, in the example I gave you, it's temporality. It's the prophet has gone and the imam has not yet come. That's how you think about secularity in temporal terms. And he's very explicit about it because he thinks the secular division makes no sense. That it's impossible to formulate. How can you separate these things out? But you can do it in temporal terms in a way that, while not itself being theological, he walks a fine balance. Nevertheless, it uses all these theological ideas of finality and of the occultation and return of the 12th Imam. So he's doing a kind of shift, I think, with the idea of the secular there. Also, the non-Muslim parallels and essence. Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think Amir Ali might equally have suggested that Hinduism and Islam, rather than Christianity and Islam, are the two that belong in a pair here, as religions not named by founding figures. And insofar as Hinduism becomes a system of this kind, it too has to deal with this problem of subjectivation. Hinduism too becomes an agent in this, and it does things, or it acts through people. But I think in Hinduism, a lot of that language goes into spiritualism and spirituality in a way that it doesn't perhaps with Islam, or it does with Sufism, which, as I said, can be peeled off and put in departments of religion and studied in that way. But essence, yeah, well, the thing about, you might never arrive at the essence of what Islam is, but you're doing it in the same mold or in the same framework, and that's what's rigid. So, Iqbal will say, he has a whole comparative religious thing in a way, where he'll say, Buddhism is about pain, and there's pain and suffering in the world, and how do you get rid of pain, and Christianity is about sin, and how do you get rid of Islam is about fear. And so how do you get rid of fear? And so the principle of Islam is fearlessness, and that means will. What is most important about Islam is will. In order to be fearless, you need to foster the will. You can see the Nietzschean lineage and all the rest, but it's not just Nietzsche. And it's about power, if you will, sovereignty. Christianity is about something. So, he has that idea of Islam's essence. But in all cases, you're talking about, if you will, the spirit of Islam, like what is it? How does it come out of this system? About Khurshid partnership and empire. Yeah, as I was saying, you have a lot of Muslim thinkers in this period who pick up on this. Now, they might want to be, as it were, more equal partners in the way that Blunt also seemed to be trying to suggest. Blunt himself goes to India. And, he's in communication with Amir Ali and Syed Ahmad Khan and all kinds of people. He's really against the empire. But he's also an influential figure within it. So, they are, and of course, there are these sub-imperial visions that other scholars have written about, where the Indians can run parts of the empire for Britain, in fact, for themselves. And even Gandhi in his earlier days is thinking along not sub-imperial lines, but what would it mean if you democratize the empire? India would suddenly become the leading power in it because of its population. So the empire then becomes somewhat of an irrelevance in a sense. How to define Islam? Well, as I was saying, I mean, I don't have a definition, but all these people seem to. And what I found of interest in Wilfred Cantwell Smith's, he may be entirely wrong, for all I know, essay is, though he doesn't draw out the implications of it, in pointing out that the word Islam is a verbal noun that implies action or practice of some kind. He seems to be suggesting that it itself has a political valence, that it is not a property, that it represents a political relationship. And you can call that submission, or you can call that making peace with, say, God. And I find that interesting. I have no idea, as a scholar of modern Islam, whether it has any resonance in pre-modern times. Probably not. But in modern times, it strikes me as an interesting idea to have. But I wouldn't say that there is an essence or a definition of Islam, partly because there's a presumption that would force me to presume that Islam is a proper name and names a system, and therefore I can define it in the way hierarchy have defined it. So I will, withhold my judgment on that.
It's a fitting end, I think, with withholding. So thank you again to Professor Devji and to all of you for coming. It's been a real pleasure. So thanks.
Thank you.